Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to Quilt Along number 21 on the free Motion Quilting Project. Last week we worked on getting our quilt top put together and breaking it up with something called a Zen break. So we have lots of different areas to fill with our 5 different independent designs that we've learned so far this year. So this week we're simply going to take those designs and put them in these areas. And some designs are easier and some designs are harder. So let's get on the machine to see how this works in free motion.
Let's get started in the center of the quilt within one of the loops. And within the loop we're going to quilt Loopy Line. So I'm just going to start forming some loops and wiggling around more or less in a row. And I'm trying to fill this area in a way that will allow me to stitch down and around, so that way I can come out of the space kind of in the same spot that I entered it. And the reason for this is because it's a loop, because it's a kind of a centralized area, it's going to be very easy to stitch myself into a corner, and I don't want to do a lot of travel stitching. So as you can see, I'm kind of working my way down to the base of the area, and then I'm going to basically rotate the quilt and stitch a row straight back down, and that will get me set up very nicely to move to the next area of the quilt to fill it with a different design. When it comes to filling with Loopy Line, this design moves very quickly, and I'm running the machine very fast. So I'm going to unmute so you can hear the machine and how fast it's running and how I'm dealing with starts and stops as I need to rotate the quilt and shift it around. Obviously, this is an area of stippling, and I hope you were able to see how carefully I travel stitched into this area. I didn't have to break thread between the two sections. I just travel stitched in and started quilting the new design. And one thing you might want to do before you start quilting each section is to lay the quilt out and take a look at it and decide where you want each design to go. That's what I did, and I wrote a little note like Stippling or Loopy Line within each section, so that way I remembered what was going to go in each place, because I really like the idea of having none of the designs butting up against each other, so no areas where stippling is right next to stippling. Maybe that's a little perfectionist, but that's just the way I do it. For one design in particular, you might want to mark some guidelines on your quilt, and that is circuit board. Circuit board is based on right angles. It's all straight lines and sharp angles, and right angles specifically. So I just marked basically a straight line running vertically and a straight line running horizontally, so that way I had some kind of visual guide to line this design up with in order to create those right angles and keep everything very boxy and very angular. And that's the only design that's really going to be tricky in this quilt because everything is so curvy and fluid. It was just a little trickier in order to fit it into the space. But with those guidelines, you can see how I'm just not really running along those lines necessarily. I'm just kind of using them as a visual guide to say, okay, well, there's a straight line. I need to keep all of these lines running parallel or perpendicular to that line so that way they stay consistent and it looks good. And of course, this design I had to slow down quite a bit on and stitch a lot more carefully. So I'm going to unmute so you can hear what that sounds like. Now let's get started with zippling, and this area is going to be a little tricky to see simply because I'm stitching over some light colored fabrics, but I hope you can see that all of the straight lines and sharp angles in this design don't have to be perfectly boxy square or lined up with any lines of the quilt. So it's a lot more freeform and it fits and fills the quilt just as easily as stippling, sharp stippling, or loopy line. So this is going to be a design that you can definitely play with and have some fun with. That's a little bit less nitpicky as circuit board, and that's a really fun thing about this quilt, is that you're definitely going to have an opportunity to pick out what your favorites are and what's going to work best for you as you're quilting it. Now let's listen to some zippling in this quilt. Now let's get started filling one last section with sharp stippling, and this design is a little bit of a combination of stippling and zippling, where you've got those nice curvy fluid shapes, but you've also got some very nice sharp points as well. And it's going to fill and fit very easily. Again, it just really depends on how your hands, how your body, how your brain works as to what design is going to be easiest for you, what is going to fit and fill in the most natural fashion. And it's really hard to say. Everybody has a different favorite design, especially initially as a beginner. So it's going to be something to just kind of play with and have fun with. And if you find a design that's just like pulling teeth, don't worry about it too much. Just fill as much as you can with it and then move on to another design and come back to the design in a couple months and see how it feels then, because it's really amazing how much your stitchability can change over a couple months of practice and experimentation. So let's listen to how this design works and then finish up the quilt.
So here's what the quilt looks like when it's finished, and I want to kind of guide you through how I quilted it, because in this situation I really did quilt this the exact way that I would really quilt a real quilt. There's been a lot of questions on a quilt along so far as when I'm quilting something just to teach and when I'm quilting something the way I would really quilt it, and I really did quilt this way. First off, these two loops were already filled, and so I started stitching right here, and you can see my threads, and filled that area with Loopy Line. Rather than break thread, I instead travel stitched out and got to this area and filled it with Stippling. Worked my way via rows, just stitching rows back and forth over here, and stitched down to this section and filled this section with Loopy Line. Just to make sure that this area was filled, I kind of travel stitched in here and filled this area with Stippling, come back out, and filled in the rest with Loopy Line, came down, filled in here with sharp stippling, and ran on a thread. Then started my thread back up right here, filled to this point right here. This is some zippling, and then down for stippling, into this corner with Loopy Line and more zippling. I broke thread at this point and moved all the way over here, where this section was filled with circuit board. And I started my thread here, filled with circuit board down, turned that corner, filled this area with Loopy Line, then up into this section with circuit board, and finally finished off with some more sharp stippling. So you can kind of see it was a circular progression around the quilt. It didn't necessarily make sense. Because the quilt was largely secured with the breakup, the Zen break, and those lines of quilting, I really didn't have to worry so much about quilting directly from the inside to the outside. I just kind of filled in the best way with the least amount of travel stitching and the least amount of thread breaks. I broke thread 3 times, only for the bobbin, and once to move across the quilt because it would have been too much travel stitching. So I hope that makes sense and that you will give this method a try and experiment with quilting all 5 of the designs we've learned so far this year in this modern quilt. Make sure to link up your blog post with any progress you've had on this project, and of course, it's time to go quilt.
If you are ready to experiment with even more free motion quilting filler designs, check out the book From Daisy to Paisley, which features 50 beginner level free motion quilting designs. Learn more at daystyledesigns.com.